Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Navigating Uncertainty, Trump Administration, Industry and Policy Disruption, and Cleantech Implications. My name is Anthony Schiavo, Senior Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux, and I'll be moderating and leading today's session. I'm joined here by five of my colleagues, Kristen Marshall, Josh Haslin, Ian Reinhardt, and Chloe Herrera, who represent all the different industries and technologies that Lux covers. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is still strong. And with that, we can jump right into the presentation. I don't think I need to set up why we're here. I don't think I need to explain who this guy is. I think everyone is well aware that Donald Trump is back in the White House. Instead, I'm going to simply set up some basic tensions and themes that we expect to continue throughout his second presidency. And then we'll get right into the sector-specific impacts. And we'll hear from each of my colleagues on how Trump's presidency is already beginning to shape their areas of research. And lastly, I'll leave you with a few final thoughts, what to look for, and how to navigate this new era of Trump presidency that we're in. First, I think it is worth talking about the new Trump coalition, because it is different than 2016. The first major pillar is the Silicon Valley billionaires. And this is represented, of course, most loudly by Elon Musk, who has been a very, very vocal member of Trump's new government. But it's not just Elon Musk. At the inauguration, we had Tim Cook, Sam Altman, we had the CEOs of other major tech corporations. And J.D. Vance, his vice president, is a close associate of Peter Thiel's. Second, we have the Heritage Foundation style conservatives. These tend to have a very libertarian bent, but also a very pro-American bent. And the Heritage Foundation is perhaps most famous for authoring the Project 2025 document that was controversial during the presidential election. And of course, there are still the traditional Republicans, to the extent that the Republican Party has not been fully reshaped by Trump, and they have their own priorities. And so I think what's important to recognize is that these different groups have very different attitudes towards many of the key issues of the Trump presidency. Immigration is a key example where, Silicon Valley set tends to favor programs like the H-1B, where they've gotten a lot more pushback from the Heritage Foundation set. So the relative strength of these three pillars will really shape a lot of the policy outcomes. Speaking of tensions within the government, one of the key tensions is between Trump's desire to wield executive power and the move towards more limited government. On the right here, we have the logo of DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, and this was tweeted out by Elon Musk. And it really seeks to cut the federal bureaucracy to the greatest degree possible, right? Really, really shrink the government. But it's often that federal bureaucracy that's responsible for executing Trump's priorities on things like energy, drilling, for example. So we will have to see, how this plays out and what ultimately ends up being favored here. Secondly, we have the national security concern versus the anti-ESG sentiment. Trump is very pro-America. He wants a strong, energy-independent country. But as we'll just discuss in a moment, he took the pretty dramatic step of banning all new wind permits, right? Wind is 10% of American energy, and it's an abundant natural resource for us. So there's already this clear conflict between their stated goals of national security and supply chains versus the desire to punish disfavored technologies. And lastly is, of course, inflation, right? And particularly inflation versus tariffs. Economists expect that Trump's across-the-board tariff plans, if implemented, would be really dramatic in terms of raising prices. And Trump has proven himself to be quite sensitive to economic news and economic sentiment. Will this fear of bringing back inflation prevent some of his impulses on tariffs? Remains to be seen. And lastly, of course, we have to ask if he can even deliver. Trump has a very, very narrow majority in the House, and he does control the Senate. So he has all three branches of government, but it may not be easy to pass major legislative works with such a tight divide between the House. So with that, I want to get into the sector-specific impacts. And first, I'd like to invite my colleague, Chloe, to talk to us about the energy space. Now, Chloe, we've already seen some big moves on energy. Drill, baby, drill was the word of the day. But do you really think that Trump will have a major impact on the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, so I mean, we already saw it with his previous administration, an emphasis on the oil and gas industry. And even now, he's come out strong, wanting low-cost energy. You discussed the ban on the wind projects. But what I think we should all keep in mind is that this is going to just be a 4-year administration. And there's already quite a lot of momentum behind decarbonization. So really, any potential impacts are really going to be short term. The oil and gas companies operating in the US are also operating elsewhere, and other countries will continue to have their climate goals that these companies will have to adhere to. So I would say that we're going to see a really big short-term leap in kind of the more oil and gas heavy sector, but there shouldn't be any long-term changes to their strategy, especially as the more countries outside of the U.S. are kind of getting geared up for this decarbonization effort. And I'd also like to emphasize that, he's come after electric vehicles as well. But we've seen a pretty steady rise in electric vehicles. We've seen a lot of support for initiatives that support EV battery manufacturing. And like I said, you're going to see kind of this more short-term delay in support. But overall, we expect momentum to continue despite all of these new policies.
What about the utility sector? Because utilities, I think, have been under a lot more pressure. Everything from wildfires in California to now this ban on wind. And there's also been hope for things like permitting reform. What's possible under a Trump administration?
Yeah, so I think there's a potential upside that we might see a little bit less regulation in the power sector, which would impact timelines. We know that getting grid capacity up and running is a significant hurdle. And, if we see a little bit of deregulation there, that could be potentially advantageous. I'd also like to point out we have seen support for nuclear from the Trump administration, at least in their last run. And what that would mean for nuclear is if you can get the administrative and regulatory costs of nuclear down, it could be a potentially attractive energy source in the U.S. So despite this ban on wind projects, which is really a killer for renewable energy, there's some hope here for nuclear. And then the last thing I kind of want to emphasize is we're going to be seeing a lot more LNG over the next 4 years. But what that means is you are also going to start seeing a little bit more need for carbon capture. So you can start looking at kind of shorter term point source carbon capture for those types of projects. And we might just kind of see that start rolling out as well.
All right. I want to turn now to my colleague, Ian. Ian, Trump has threatened tariffs. He did not immediately make good on them. And I should mention that we decided to close our sort of finalize our script here, finalize our comments on Tuesday. So, that's the lens we're looking at here. But as of Tuesday, Trump was threatening to implement tariffs potentially by the end of the month, but had not put them in place yet. What are the risks here for industrials, and how are you thinking about this potential tariff implementation?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Well, there's a wide range of outcomes and a lot of uncertainty, but it's safe to say that there will be meaningful change. There's too much at stake politically for Trump to do nothing. Now, as you mentioned, rather than day one, he bought himself a little bit of time with his threats to slap tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico. February 1st, he said. And so I think what he's looking for is some type of concession, some change in the trading patterns so that he can declare victory and move on. This was a pretty typical pattern in his first administration. And there's definitely scope here for him to take action. The trade weighted average of tariffs on industrial imports is only 2%. The U.S. has done a lot over past governments to be part of a free trade community. And so here, the tail risk is that trading partners don't blink and that a tit for tat tariff battle ensues. And here, I think for global exporters, there's a lot of risk that this level playing field gets tilted and that countries and governments look to protect their national champions in retaliation and create a more favorable domestic market for those type of companies. So for a lot of the large companies, the global exporters that we deal with, thinking about being agile in those markets and being very attentive to the industries and sectors where the other countries will retaliate and look to put up barriers as a way of building leverage against Trump's trade actions.
Well, what about decarbonization? We heard from Chloe that LNG, natural gas is going to be a big part of the story going forward. But from an industrial perspective, of course, there are some supply chain concerns, right? Plenty of industrial players supply wind components, probably not feeling very happy right now. But big picture, what does this mean for decarbonization, especially of the industrial sector in the U.S. and maybe beyond as well?
Sure, it's a very fascinating time. And I've been puzzling it out a little bit because in the United States, we don't have a strong federal framework the way you have in other countries that have a carbon price, carbon tax. EU, of course, has the ETS, and now the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So you have all this policy structure, but now there's both policy and political space for companies to walk back their decarbonization plans. So companies that are under financial pressure to decarbonize, and they're balancing that with very expensive capital retooling to decarbonize. I think we're going to have this separation here. Companies like in the steel sector, U.S. Steel, that's in dire straits compared to its competitors, may say, hey, look, we need to focus on profitability, improve our margins, and pull back from some of these decarbonization investments. So there will be a little bit of a split, a divergence in this market between companies that are putting their money where their mouth is and those that need to think more short term. However, for those that are still looking to 2030, 2040, and 2050, don't press pause on the high risk, high reward, long-term R&D projects. There needs to be 5 or 10 years for some of these transformational projects to bear fruit. I'm thinking about electrochemical production of steel and some of the really transformative approaches that Lux has been publishing about the last few years.
Okay. And when we think about the very long-term implications here, one sector with both some significant long-term as well as some very near-term disruptions from the new Trump administration is the chemical sector, right? Which has also been working on those electrochemical methods. But I think there's a much more upfront concern around the future of the EPA. Under the Biden administration, it's been maybe more combative or more assertive. Kristen, what are you expecting going forward with this new Trump administration?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Well, first and foremost, we are all aware that deregulation is a big initiative for the Trump administration in favor of business. And for the chemicals industry, this puts into question, of course, the EPA, what will become of it, and laws such as TSCA, or the Toxic Substances Control Act, and how those will be implemented. So the last time Trump was in office, he appointed a former American Chemistry Council executive, as well as a big opponent of the EPA, Nancy Beck, in charge of overseeing toxic chemical regulation. And so during her time in that role, she and her team effectively froze the process for placing bans and restrictions on existing substances on the market. And in addition to Nancy, during the last administration, other chemical industry veterans were appointed to the EPA, like Lynn Decleva, who was formerly at DuPont, where her job was to expedite EPA approval process for new chemicals. And so what we're seeing is, according to names that are reappearing on the EPA staff directory, both Nancy Beck and Lynn Decleva are both listed there. So it seems like in 2025, the EPA is shaping up to be very similar to how it was structured in 2017. But what does this mean in practice for the next 4 years? Well, first, it means that chemicals that have been recently deemed to present unreasonable risk to health, where we're seeing risk management rules being determined, we think that these are going to be possibly delayed. However, let's face it, the system that currently exists is already really incredibly slow and not super effective. It takes years for chemicals to be prioritized as high risk and then evaluated and then regulated. But that doesn't mean that chemical clients and those in the chemicals industry shouldn't pay attention to substances of concern that are in their portfolios because of mounting, especially when there's mounting evidence pointing to their harm. And this is because there still exists state level regulations globally, as well as you have to pay attention to brands and retailers that are placing restrictions around chemicals in use. So if something is appearing to be bad or perceived as bad, you still need to flag it in your product portfolios. Where I am the most interested, however, is the expediting of new chemicals on the market. And so that's where hopefully deregulation could speed up things, maybe even help the introduction of beneficial products on the market, and even in support of technology and infrastructure advancement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one area where there is a lot of interest in launching new chemicals is the bio-based sector, right? The bio-based sector, I think, was one of the maybe more unexpected winners from the Biden administration. They got a number of supportive pieces of legislation there. But will this continue under the Trump administration? There's, a lot of anti-green sentiment floating around Washington these days.
Yeah, that's another great question. And it's one that we're getting a lot from clients today. So how the Trump administration is going to impact the adoption of technologies like bio-based materials and chemicals, other technologies that are branded around decarbonization or being, climate positive technologies, especially since Trump has surrounded himself with climate denialists and not, doesn't really see the value in tackling climate change head on with his administration. And we saw this on day one when he pulled out of Paris Agreement and suspended further funding for the Biden administration's IRA. So while admittedly, this doesn't seem to bode well of these technologies, it's important to remember that Trump is all about branding and that many technologies falling under climate tech, like bio-based fuels and chemicals, can still be repositioned or aligned with Trump's other initiatives like energy independence or supply chain resilience. And it's worth noting that, bio-based fuels and chemicals in particular, they have support with farmers and others that are following within Trump's constituencies. So while the Trump administration has this drill baby drill stance that's concerning, he may decide to take other steps to support such industries in the future. However, the drill baby drill stance is really a concern just because
it's a big challenge.
Costs. Yeah, it's a big challenge. Costs are first and foremost, what could help to make these technologies, need to make these technologies competitive in the future. And if we're we're drilling for more oil and allowing for more inexpensive raw materials in the market, then that just hurts the competitiveness of these solutions.
Absolutely. I mean, I still remember 2014 through 16 when low oil prices really hurt the whole bio-based sector. And I think all of these energy, chemicals, even industrials, they all will have impacts on the consumer sector. But maybe the consumer sector is the one area where we expect the biggest potential for disruption. There's already been a lot of news. Under the previous FDA, Red 3 got banned. But Josh, what do you think about the consumer sector and guys like potentially RFK, coming in and bringing a very different viewpoint to the regulation?
I think first and foremost, everything we've already heard matters to the consumer industry. So I want to start there. Everything from tariffs to energy to chemicals, all those things are multifaceted and really important to drive food costs, all that. But in addition, I think when we think about the effect of the Trump administration on the outlook for consumer industry, there's two areas I think we haven't talked about that are important. One is consumer safety. The other is the sort of consumer workforce. So, starting with consumer safety, as you indicated, we do have some interesting individuals moving forward that perhaps create some interesting tension. There's an interest in increasing how the administration performs its efforts towards creating safety in consumer products through RFK Jr. again, if confirmed in that role. And what does that mean? Well, what it means first and foremost is the FDA has already been restructured towards abilities to maybe increase assets to the Office of Inspections and Investigations. That all happened in the Biden administration through Commissioner Califf. And then, what does that mean though? It means there may be more opportunities, like with Red 3, to take some particular ingredients off the shelf. Now, Red 3, not to be confused, this is something that was already restricted in a lot of other products, just not in sort of food products. So we're seeing that advance. And the reality is the government Office of Accountability has indicated that there already aren't enough workforce to do the work that the government, the FDA in particular, needs to do. So that means that things like GRAS approved things generally regarded as safe ingredients have the potential in the future to be more scrutinized. So again, is it deregulation? Is it not? I think a lot of this does depend on whether or not RFK Jr. gets confirmed in that seat. But overall, what we could see is safety take center hold, and that does mean there could be some restrictions, but it'll depend what Musk does with Doge to say where those resources go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just as likely, we were talking earlier, to see regulation on some of the more established ingredients, but also deregulation for some very experimental, everything from raw milk to ayahuasca or whatever we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, and I just want to point out before we jump ahead, what's going to, when we think about innovation, what's going to be affected? Again, if RFK goes through, expect maybe natural ingredients to be less prioritized in the safety risk, and things that have already been approved but have lacked the necessary oversight to be targeted. So think about GRAS ingredients that are already there, or companies in innovative segments that are trying to bring a new product to market, and before we're using the GRAS pathway to get there, that might be slowed up. And I think that's where it begins to affect innovation specifically.
And perhaps Trump's most signature promise during the campaign was to deport millions of Americans. And he's begun laying the framework to do that in his first few days in office already.
Yes.
Beyond the human cost, what does this mean for the consumer supply chain?
Yeah, I think it's straightforward. Resources are going to move to the border. Trump, the administration previously didn't get the chance to do all they wanted to do there. So we're seeing the potential for a lot of assets move towards the border. What does that mean? It means that workforce that does come across or is already across, and that's 44% of our undocumented agriculture workers, 68% foreign from the country, will likely be up against something, right? And that likely means some kind of impact on the workforce. I think right now that seems very probable. I think everybody's getting prepped for what that might look like, especially without some kind of improved visa process, which it doesn't seem, at least so far, right, hasn't went with some of these executive orders that we saw come out. Instead, quite the opposite, a very restrictive approach, right, across the world. So what does that mean for innovation in this case? I think we're going to see automation come back, just like it did for COVID with disruption. I think this is another disruption, and let's face it, we may have some other diseases coming our way, which are already entering the agriculture food systems globally. So, you know, these are clear disruptors, and it really is important that we do move forward thinking about automation and how it can build resilience into these ecosystems.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. And I did misspeak slightly earlier. Trump has promised to deport millions of immigrants.
That's right.
With that, I do want to now move to our outlook, a few final thoughts. First, I think that we are now fully in this era of a very new relationship, or a very different relationship between business and politics. Whether it is the tech CEOs lining up to kiss the ring in Washington, or the very interventionist role, you know, Trump essentially outright banning new wind power in America. I think this has been building since the first Trump administration. Certainly Biden took a much more interventionist role, and I think it's here to stay. Even whatever administration comes next will almost certainly take on and continue to take on this very interventionist role. And I think for executives, navigating the political waters will become a key skill and a key responsibility. It already is, and it certainly absolutely will be under the Trump administration. Secondly, I think there's going to be real pressure on long-term planning. Really, you know, I call this the Jenga innovation environment. Innovators are expected to build something new while the Jenga blocks are being pulled out from underneath them in the form of potentially government funding, in the form of regulatory support, in the form of potentially corporate support, right? So innovators really need to prepare to do more with less, and they really need to prepare to make those Jenga blocks much more sticky by building the relationships and ensuring the long-term support. And this is something that we are going to be writing a lot about and discussing a lot in our work, and especially the first half of this year. So what to look for? What are some of the signals? One, who is close to Trump? And that's both politically and even physically, right? I think we've seen from the first administration that Trump is, very influenced by the people around him. If someone like Elon Musk, is in the White House every day, then that's going to have a big shift on policy. And we've already seen a lot of volatility. Vivek Ramaswamy, the co-leader of Doge, only made it -1 days into the administration before he was let go. So that volatility from the first Trump administration in terms of staffing will definitely continue in the second Trump administration. And secondly, look to stocks and financial performance. Trump is very sensitive to the stock market, and he will, likely take his cue on many issues from the response that the markets have to policies, especially things like tariffs. So as we go forward, first I would say, in 4 years, we're likely to get another big swing in terms of policy, but this does have long-term implications, right? Trump's priorities and his actions in his first term, really shaped a lot of the Biden administration, things like tariffs, right? His second term is likely to shape, the long-term contours of the American political system just as much, if not more. Second, many of Trump's policies will continue Biden priorities. Biden was very, very interested in building America First energy, if only in a slightly different way, right? And maybe including wind power. But on areas like tariffs, on areas like support potentially for biochemicals, there will be a lot of continuity between the two administrations. But disruption is probably still the order of the day. The consumer segment definitely is the most at risk for disruption. But every sector, whether it's energy, whether it's chemicals, whether it's even the industrial segment, there are real concerns for disruption, right? And companies are going to have to be agile. in order to really manage these challenges and manage their national as well as global supply chains. So with that, I want to say thank you. We're now going to open it up for questions. We'll be taking as many questions as we have time for. If you have them, you can type them in the questions box. If we don't get to your question on this call, we will be in touch after the webinar. So while my co-hosts are joining me, one area where we're getting a lot of questions, and I think that was a little bit absent from the presentation itself, was AI, right? AI is talk of the town. And, I have a couple questions here. I'll start by saying, Trump has definitely taken a very different tack on AI than the Biden administration was. He has already essentially ripped up the Biden administration executive order on AI safety. So he's taking a much more pro AI industry stance, right? Moving more quickly with less regulated AI. And I think also you're seeing, the AI industry is pushing very hard to securitize AI, right? Make it part of essentially the national security apparatus. And I think you'll see that Trump is responsive to that. He announced already, I think, $100 billion in private sector financing for a major data center project, with companies like Oracle, and I think SoftBank is involved as well. So I really expect to see Donald Trump really deepen the U.S. government's relationship with AI companies, and also, frankly, to leverage AI for, his various governmental ends, whether that's, national security or at the border, and not really worry about the consequences. But there's also the angle of energy. Chloe, AI, you mentioned carbon capture. Tech companies have been very serious about decarbonization, or at least have made a lot of noise. And AI is one of the areas where carbon capture makes the most sense for data centers. What are you thinking about the sort of the conflux of data centers and energy under Donald Trump? Chloe, I think you're on mute. Still can't hear you. We're going to come back to you, Chloe, while you work on that. We have another question here. It's about the nature of the sort of startup ecosystem under Donald Trump. Josh, I know you had some thoughts on this, but how are we expecting startup innovation to change under this new Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost, it's clear, right, that money is moving where it's going. And does that mean that, a deregulated world opens up opportunities for more money or less money? I think right now, I can build off the AI discussion just to bring it up a little bit. I do think we're going to see innovation in AI. I think the important piece is, in a deregulated world with AI, what does that mean? Particularly when we talk about, again, consumer safety. We know that there's a lot of challenges with this. We've seen it with insurance and other areas where AI algorithms have really incorrectly assessed situations, right? And resulted in pretty substantial legal battles that were not successfully won, at least by the plaintiff, which in this case would be the company, right? So I see that happening. So let's think about that as Wild Wild West. And as a result, be hard on yourself to say, is this going to impact consumers negatively? Because that's at the point, right, where legal battles begin. The second place I just want to bring up is agriculture. We didn't really get a chance to talk about it too much, talk about workers, but what about the fate of the rural communities that we're talking about? Are we going to see innovation move away from them? I think right now, it's safe to say that money will likely move to the agriculture industry. I think what's unclear is, will it move to just reduce prices for producers, or will it move towards innovation? The reality is the previous administration put a lot of money into innovation. Are we going to see that go away or not? I expect we're going to see a little bit of both. I think a lot of subsidy is going to go towards ag, but there will also be into maybe tying biorefinery into agriculture production systems, right, to lower costs, add new revenue sources for natural gas, things like that, which we've already seen. So I'm really curious to see how that plays out, but I do expect there to be a balance there for sure.
Chloe, if you're back with us, Hopefully,
Yes. Can you
volume
am I
on.
back?
We can hear you. Excellent.
Great.
Any last thoughts about data centers, energy under the Trump administration?
Yeah, so data centers are probably the biggest source of load growth in the near term. And we do see that a lot of companies are looking for low carbon power to supply that electricity. And even with wind power, we've seen some power purchase agreements being signed. I think that in the next 4 years, we're going to see a continued interest in that low carbon power. We've done some work around the economics of low carbon power for data centers. And while combined cycle gas turbines are, of course, going to be the lower cost option, there's a lot of opportunity for solar and wind to power those as well. So we're going to need a healthy mix of it.
So there's still an economic case, it seems like, for renewables, even under a Trump administration.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. I want to thank, first of all, my colleagues for joining me today. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for listening to us. Again, if you have questions that we weren't able to get to, we will follow up. But I just want to thank you so much and look forward to some of our upcoming webinars as well.